Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Donvan, and welcome to the Atlantic Summit that we are calling Thrive, the Children's Summit. And we're really happy that so many of you are joining us today for this conversation that could not be more timely. The children of today were already facing a challenging world, one that was complicated by issues like technology and other forces outside of their control. And then along comes COVID and the pandemic, which has exacerbated matters even further and has upended every aspect of kids' lives, their schooling, their nutrition, their housing, their mental health. We're in a situation that is completely different from anything any of us have ever experienced. So, how do we prepare our children for life during these uncertain times? That is the question that we're going to be taking on in this summit. And we have fortunately been able to put together a terrific group of educators and doctors and advocates who are here to bring their thoughts to help parents and caregivers and kids themselves navigate these unprecedented times. The goal here is not only to set our children up for future success, but actually to ignite a passion to help the kids of today actually thrive. I'd like to thank Nestle Waters North America for supporting the Atlantic's journalism today. And before I introduce our first panel, I would like to invite you, all of you out there, to be part of this conversation. Our moderators will be taking questions throughout the session. So we want those questions to be part of our conversation. So please feel free to submit your own using the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So let's move forward. Here to discuss the challenges that are facing parents during the pandemic, I'd like you to welcome Dr. Christine Beckman, Professor and Price Family Chair in Social Innovation at USC Price School of Public Policy, and Dr. Dawn Dow, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland at College Park. And here to lead that discussion is my friend and colleague, journalist Susan Salmi. Susan, the screen is yours.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Beckman, Dr. Dow, thank you for joining us. Here's the crisis. Millions upon millions of families relied on an education and childcare infrastructure that's been decimated since March. And even before the pandemic, working parents were already struggling with the 24/7 demands of the modern workplace. You've both written about this. And Dr. Beckman, I'd like to start with you. What has the pandemic revealed about the way Americans are expected to work and parent that is most troubling to you? And on a more positive note, is there any way for parents to make the most of this unprecedented challenge?
Yeah, so our book came out. We did our research just before the pandemic hit, and so we were studying these 9 families, and they were already struggling, right? I mean, trying to work and parent and juggle. The expectations have always been, I would say, impossible. Right? Our title is "Dreams of the Overworked." I mean, that it's more than people can try and accomplish. And what we saw is how much people relied on others to help them make it through the day. That was, friends, neighbors, caregivers, teachers, extended family, and of course, with the pandemic, that just disappeared in an instant, right? Even extended family weren't always comfortable coming into the home with young kids because of fears of their own health, and so in an instant, all of that disappeared. And the stress and anxiety that parents are under trying to juggle those things on their own. It was already hard, and now it's even left completely on their own. Has been, I think, devastating, and the prospect of a lot of schools aren't opening up, in the area where I live. Everything is still virtual, so there's no end in sight. And so people are really anxious, wanting to do the best for their kids, but also needing to work to manage other aspects of their life. And so I guess the hopeful part is maybe helping us really see that what we're asking working parents to do is impossible. They can't do it without more infrastructure and without more support, whether that's federal policies, whether that's organizations helping better. But it's a community effort, right? There's you're starting to hear people talk about pods and understanding that families, individual little single parents, even dual working parents, they can't do it on their own, and they need more help.
What you call scaffolding, the other sorts of infrastructure.
Yeah.
We also talk about the myths that parents are dealing with to be perfect at work and at home.
And of course, that feeds into our insecurity. We love our kids. We want to be wonderful parents, but these expectations for what it means to be a perfect parent assume that you have nothing else to do, that you don't need to work, you don't, and that it would be even possible for one person to give all these things to our children, and it's not. Because it's impossible. My worry is that it's so easy to just increase the anxiety, and that leaks through to our kids, right? The parents that had the most resources, that didn't mean they were less stressed, right? That their expectations for what they should do in terms of activities and quality time, and like those expectations just kept ratcheting up, and then those parents were despite all the resources that they had, were anxious. Whereas other families that hadn't really bought into this idea that we need to be perfect, and sort of recognize that, all right, so maybe my kid watched more television today than might be, but given all that I was trying to manage, the other kids, my work, that was the best that I can do, and sort of giving parents a break on that, I think, is super important.
Right. Well, Dr. Dowd, let's talk about disparities a bit. Working from home seems to be two things at once. It's hard, especially if you have young children, but it's also a luxury that essential workers don't have. So it's this odd thing. It's a hard luxury. And we already know from research that women are suffering huge job losses. Black families are dealing with elevated rates of illness and death. And then there's a racial reckoning beyond that. So I was hoping maybe you could shed some light on the unequal burden here delivered by this pandemic, and also what we might be thinking about to try to mitigate some of the damage.
So first, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I want to start off just by emphasizing that Black families, like other families, also care about trying to protect their children's joy, trying to help them fulfill their dreams in life, and raising strong citizens who are trying to make their path in life. But as you said, the COVID epidemic has had an unequal impact on African American families, and in many ways is really just sort of amplifying the existing inequalities that have existed prior to this. So, prior to COVID-19, tracking national patterns, African Americans were more likely to rely on childcare. They're less likely to be in a position where they can work from home. So while many parents and I study middle and upper middle class parents, so many parents are juggling some of the challenges that Dr. Beckman has highlighted in her book. Often they're less likely to be able to be someone who can telecommute. And so they're on the front lines. They're frontline workers. They're more likely to be exposed to COVID. And they're also more likely to be exposed to a healthcare. They are exposed to a healthcare system that is characterized by racial structural racism and implicit bias, right? So even when we think about the experiences of young children, a young child who's going to school is more likely to have a parent at home who's stressed about thinking about childcare, about more likely to have a family member or have themselves experience exposure or death related to COVID-19. And before all this happened, these families were, dealing with the issues that you raised around having this racial reckoning. This is not the racial reckoning that these families are experiencing are not new reckonings. They're ones that I think in some ways afforded by the COVID crisis and the fact that many people were at home and glued to their televisions have become more aware and less able to ignore the kinds of racial disparities that families are facing. But these are things that have become amplified for the Black community.
Right.
Now, when we think about sort of solutions, I think one of the things that's an opportunity in the darkness of all this time and the challenges that we face is that it really makes us have to think about the structures that are in place. I think in the presidential, the Democratic National Convention, Elizabeth Warren called childcare the infrastructure of our country, and that we don't think about it as being the infrastructure, but when we see that educational institutions and childcare facilities are closed, we see how much that can really damage our economy. And so we have to think about these structures as being part of a sort of large body of connective tissues that need to all be healthy and functioning well so that we can have a functioning society. So I think that one of the things that COVID and the protests related to racial injustice and police violence in this country has enabled us to do is to really take a hard look on how to make those structures function better for all Americans. And it's something that Black families have had to do for some time. There's always, before COVID, there was an issue of trying to find a quality, affordable childcare, right? Now that's an issue for all parents, right? So now we can use that as a lever to think about how should our society be thinking about funding these institutions? How should our local spaces be thinking about funding them? I know that there have been a lot of discussions around sort of individual, some people might call it neoliberal responses to the childcare crisis and pods, and also concerns around inequities that would come from those solutions. And I think we as a society need to think about how can we create solutions that are not going to further exacerbate the inequalities that COVID has exacerbated already.
That's a great question. Let's talk more about that then. It seems like some of the solutions, when I think about it, falls into three categories, right? There's what I can do as a proactive worker to say, communicate my needs and push back. There's what a responsible employer can do for employees. But the biggest and most important change is probably going to need to come from our government, and that's going to be structural. So I was wondering if you both could talk about those three things: what an individual can do during this time, what companies can do, what the government can and should be doing.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the long run certainly has to be the government, right? I mean, as Dr. Dow said, the pandemic has revealed that childcare and schools are not just about educating our kids; they're also about childcare, and they're where our children are while we're working. And even before the pandemic, school was out at 3, and most people had to work until 5 or 6, or if you have a split shift. I mean, so we already didn't have a system that really worked and supported families. So I think whether that's paid leave, whether that's a more robust childcare system, I think there's a whole host of governmental solutions that I think are critical, because otherwise we just keep leaving it on families and individuals, and so I think there's some things that organizations can do. I mean, I study organizations, and I think really helping. There are companies that are paying for childcare, for example, right now, in-house childcare, because childcare centers are closed. It's not enough to just sort of give your employees a laptop and say, okay, you're working from home, go at it. I mean, because there's so many other things that families are dealing with. And so really thinking more holistically about all this, whether that, groceries, like there's all sorts of things that families are having to manage that organizations could help with. And especially if we keep this remote work going forward, there's a lot of cost savings in office space and things that really should be used to support us in the at home. But I'm not confident. I mean, and this goes back to the disparities, right? Not everyone has companies that are going to be companies that could be able to do that. And so I don't want to rely on. I want companies to step up right now, but I don't think we should rely on companies to solve this problem, because it's just going to, those inequities that we were talking about are just going to continue to be exacerbated.
Right. Dr. Bell, would you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think that this is one of those situations where obviously we're in the middle of multiple crises, and it's really an all hands on deck situation. And we need to be thinking about this, as Dr. Beckman said, and the question you asked, from the state and company and individual level. And so I think at the state level, we should be thinking about how to subsidize childcare, how to fund it, how to invest in it. Think about new ways of structuring childcare so that it's safer and healthier, and give those funds to states so that they can then implement it. And I think that's something that we need to have happen across the country, because this is a crisis that's affecting all of us. And one of the key factors that's preventing the economy from getting back on track is childcare, and is our educational institutions, right? I also think that the work that companies that the government is doing can do to sort of support the fact that people have a right to be talking about the challenges that their kids are facing, not just with COVID, but in terms of all these other racial inequalities, is something that we should support as a robust discussion to help inform the policies that we create, so we include every party at the table. At the company level, I think I think it's difficult. We shouldn't necessarily rely on companies, but I also believe that companies and need to, for those who are telecommuting and who have kids at home, really think about if we need to have that Zoom meeting. Can it be on the telephone? Can your children, can you have more flexible schedules? Can you scale back the requirements of your employees right now? We live in a society where we're very much focused on productivity, and right now is a period of time where we maybe need to be thinking more holistically about our employees and thinking about ways of supporting their health and safety. At an individual level, I would say individuals need to think about embracing difficult conversations. I know that as we think about trying to create solutions to the childcare and the educational issues that our children are facing, often those with more resources can find solutions that are that work for them, but that also exacerbate inequality. So to think about that, but to also in addressing the recent discussions around racial inequality in our country, to have those kind of courageous conversations with parents that don't look like you, who are from different racial backgrounds, to understand the challenges that they're facing and try to incorporate some understanding of the kind of racial trauma that kids are experiencing from both their own day-to-day lives, but as well as what they're probably absorbing from the kinds of anxieties that their parents are having and having them operate in a society that's characterized by those challenges.
I think that's actually a great note to end on. Let's talk about the stress. We know children internalize the stress that they see around them coming from adults. What can we do to spare the children from feeling some of the effects of this toxic stress, which causes disease in and of itself?
Yeah, so Dr. Dow talked about difficult conversations, and I do think a lot of those are happening, in families where there are two parents sort of trying to share the load, trying to help each other out. Though there's also a gender inequality that's happening at home right now that we haven't spoken about, that is real, and I think the pandemic has just put more weight on women's shoulders, and trying to find a way to lighten that through conversations at home. I mean, the families that I've seen. I've gone back to visit the families we studied that are doing the best are the ones that are trying to rebuild the scaffolding in the ways that they can, whether that's through neighbors, trying to find places of getting some relief, right? It's the pods that Dr. Dow talked about, which isn't a solution, but we need to find little ways of getting more support, because it's just impossible to do this on our own.
Dr. Dow, any last words?
I would just echo the comments that Dr. Beckman has said, and say we have to find in the midst of all of this struggle moments of joy. It's easy to get focused on the darkness, and I think that we have unequal access to our abilities to focus on joy, but we need to try to take breaks from the news and really try to see if we can find some kind of silver lining and having an opportunity to spend time with our children and support their development and growth, even though the times are very challenging.
Dr. Beckman, Dr. Dow, I thank you both for joining us. I think ending on a note of joy is a great place to leave it. And now I'll be turning things back over to John.
Thanks so much, Susan. And now I'd like to bring into the conversation Nicole Lander, who is Chief Impact Officer of the Houston Food Bank, and also Kirk Mays, who is CEO of the Forgotten Harvest Food Rescue in Detroit. And we're going to be discussing another very complicated issue, particularly complicated by the pandemic, and that is the question of food insecurity, particularly as it's affecting children. And Nicole, help us out for folks who are not necessarily familiar with the term food insecurity, what it describes and what its implications are.
So many people associate food insecurity with hunger, and it's very different. So food insecurity is a lack of access to nutritious food. So when you think about that, that could be families having SNAP benefits and the first couple of weeks being able to have a meal frequently, and then by the end of the month, they're skipping meals, they're watering down food, they're just having ramen noodles for their households. And so it's the lack of access to consistent nutritious foods.
Is there an overlap with the concept of hunger as well?
Absolutely. Hunger is that symptom. That's that physiological feeling when we go without food for long periods of time. Roughly about 5% of the US population experiences hunger on a consistent basis. And so
consistent
those are those
basis.
families.
Wow,
yes.
That's astounding. And the numbers from the USDA prior to the pandemic, focusing on children, USDA says 11 million children in the United States lived in food insecure homes. And both of your organizations have been devoted to trying to support them and offer some relief. Kirk, I'd like to ask each of you very briefly, to sort of describe the model of your organizations and what you do. And then I want to have a little bit of a comparison between pre-COVID and now that we're in COVID, what the impact has been. So Kirk, tell us first about your group.
So thank you for allowing us to participate in this conversation. For Forgotten Harvest, we're a dedicated food rescue model, which means we work with community businesses, grocery stores, farmers, food manufacturers, anybody who's in the upside of the food supply chain, and we try to find the things that don't meet retail spec or don't meet their manufacturing requirements. And don't get to, for whatever reason, don't come off of the field for consumers. We get those things as donations and we turn them right back around to people in our local community.
And what was the volume of work that you were doing before COVID? What would sort of an average week be? If you can give a metric, maybe pounds of food. I'm not sure if that's the correct metric or not.
Yeah, we're around about 130,000 pounds a day before all of this, just about 6 days a week. And now we're looking at almost double, but we're down to 5 days a week because we're giving ourselves some additional breaks during the weekend and adjusting to the schedule that's available for folks. And then given the fluctuation of the food supply, we've been up to 200,000 or 300,000 pounds in a day, addressing the need and trying to keep up with the pace of the food.
So the need obviously going up. And Nicole, are you finding the same thing at the Houston Food Bank? Again, I think people are more familiar with the concept of food bank, but just in case they're not, or if we have a misconception, tell us what Houston Food Bank does and your pre and post COVID reality.
So Houston Food Bank exists to fill gaps in the community. Our primary focus is food for better lives. Food banks are large food rescue organizations. Much like Kirk described, we rescue food all through the food chain, whether it's food directly out of the field, which is produce and things of that sort, or directly from retailers or manufacturers that are unable to sell to the market. So pre-COVID, Houston Food Bank distributed around 400,000 pounds of food per day to our network of 1,500 partners. Post-COVID, we're distributing 1 million pounds of food a day.
Wow.
To our partner network.
So you're both telling me that the food is there, and I find that an interesting thing. I had guessed that would be a challenge, Kirk. For example, if one of the places that you're harvesting from would be restaurants, if all of these restaurants are shut down, is that a source of food that is now gone for you? Is that in fact what's happened? And how have you supplemented that deficit if it's there?
Well, you got to remember that a lot of the restaurants shut down, but this was an abrupt disruption of the common everyday cycle. So the immediate impact was we got a lot of donations from our restaurant partners in order to address the need immediately. Of course, with the downturn in activity, we don't get as much from large catering companies, and that's completely shut down. While the grocery stores, when there was a lot of rush onto the grocery stores didn't have much to turn around to folks. But for farmers, because of the reduction of the demand on the supply chain, because restaurants are shut down and just things have repositioned themselves, there's a lot of farmers that have food that they haven't been able to get into the normal market. So there's some places there's too much food. And if you have the right kind of infrastructure to be able to go capture it, there's a bounty of siloed products. You can get too much too quick. But then, other ways is we had to actually start going into the open market and buying food so that we could keep up with the demand that we knew that was going to be coming because of the changes that everybody's experiencing during COVID. So,
but how much financial stress does that put on Hidden Harvest to have to buy the food?
Forgotten Harvest.
I'm sorry, Forgotten. I'm sorry.
No worries. So we made a commitment before we even knew what was coming to allocate at least $1 million out of our financial reserves to be able to buy food and be able to fill our gaps. Luckily, donations started to come in, and support from groups like Feeding America and the state government started to come in, so that we didn't have to go in that direction. And some of our food providers actually gave us some donations, but it increased our spending on food in an exponential way. We went from not really buying much food at all, except for like the food for children, to make sure we had the full array of the things for the meals for kids, to buying food for whole families in bulk proportion. So we had to turn our model on the head
Right.
pretty much in a week to be
Wow.
able to address some of this
So
challenge.
a lot of innovation necessary. Speaking of innovation, I want to point out to those of you who aren't seeing our faces but only seeing our names, it's not you, it's us. We're having a technical glitch, which we're working on fixing up. But you were just hearing Kirk Mays speaking, and I'm John Don. Oh, now we're all back again. No need to have done the apology. But I want to, Nicole, ask about the impact on your business model. Again, I've done reporting on food banks, and they are places, they are gathering places. People come to those places. Now you have a social distancing challenge. What happened with the Houston Food Bank, and what adjustments did you figure out to make to serve your community?
So the greatest hit to food banks really across the nation, I'm sure Kurt can empathize with this, is that we have roughly just as many volunteers that equate to the amount of FTEs we need to do this business. And so we have about 300 FTEs, and we have about 90,000 volunteers that walk through our doors every year. We had to go from allowing 1,000 people in our building at once to 100.
Wow.
So our greatest hit was human capital. As Kurt mentioned, the food eventually came. USDA and commodities played a big role in providing food to our communities, along with FEMA and other governmental agencies that, along with Feeding America. But our greatest hit was human capital. We weren't able to have volunteers sorting food, building boxes in the building. And so for us throughout this crisis, our greatest hurdle to overcome is labor, trying to redistribute where we sort food, being very innovative and working outside. Unfortunately, in Houston, that's really tough during this time of year, specifically when we have a hurricane looming. And so really utilizing the National Guard, thinking innovatively how we engage people to volunteer on the outside of our buildings and delivering meals to people's homes, and using parking lots and places for people to work with us to get food to our community.
And in terms of the community that you serve, I understand that you've had sort of major events where people come by car, and you've just packed parking lots with people who are your clientele, basically.
Yeah, so food banks traditionally are not direct service providers. We
Uh-huh.
work through a partner network of pantries, food kitchens, schools, community centers. And because of the crisis, many of our volunteer partner run organizations had to shut down. So if everyone saw across the nation how we had lines totaling at some point 10,000 cars trying to get through and food for their households. And we were in mall parking lots, at our large football stadiums, and basketball arena parking lots across the country, providing food directly to households, most of them whom had never sought food assistance.
That I was going to ask about. So you are seeing people coming forward. I am wondering, do you feel ever that there's a question of stigma that prevents people from seeking your services?
Absolutely. Absolutely. COVID, in one way, has helped with that because we're not doing direct service and shopping inside of a pantry. Everything's really a truck to trunk
Uh-huh.
model. And so we're, for social distancing reasons, putting that food in the back of their cars. But many families will tell us they were former donors to the food bank, whether that be
Interesting.
monetary or through food drives, and are now recipients.
And Kirk, are you seeing different organizations among the organizations that Forgotten Harvest has been servicing? Do you see different organizations now seeking your services in that enormous increase that you talked about in terms of pounds of food? Are there essentially new client organizations coming to you?
Yeah, absolutely. The entire partnership framework has kind of transformed. It happened overnight. I mean, as Nicole mentioned, We went from being a managed norm in our community, knowing that there's an ongoing challenge of food security, an important reality, to overnight, everybody was concerned and trying to help with food, so getting food to the community. So stadiums, any parking lot in the community was available to us. I mean, carte blanche, basically, we could get to uh, most infrastructure in order to set ourselves up. But as things have begun to level out and folks are starting to figure out how to get back into opening back up businesses, and school parking lots are going back into play, and we're having to figure out what some of those new partnerships are going to look like. Those agencies are partners that distribute the food on a normal basis that shut down. Some of them haven't come back. Some of them won't come back. So we do have new partnerships that we're investigating. We're even thinking about whole new ways of approaching the distribution network, because as Nicole mentioned again, we typically don't get on the front line to distribute the foods ourselves. We work with a partner, a network of
Right.
partners, but
Well, you
in
mentioned,
some ways, we need to look at that model going forward.
but your mention of school parking lots for me brings the focus back to the theme of this summit, which is the impact of COVID-19 on children. And I want to take that to Nicole. In Texas, I understand 1 in 4 children are at risk of hunger. That's higher than the national average. Schools have been closed since March. Schools is where kids who need the nutrition have been provided with, some cases breakfast, in more cases lunch. As we go forward, as the school system sort of reopens, but not every day, what's the thinking on addressing that kind of breakdown in this routine that at least was providing meals?
So yes, when 60% of public school students in your state rely on free and reduced lunch, you have no choice but to find ways to partner with schools to catch children that are falling through the gaps. So households, as mentioned by Dr. Dow and Dr. Beckham, are already dealing with trade-offs in paying rent, utilities, childcare, and how do they manage that with their food budget. Specifically, when you lose access to breakfast, lunch, and supper, in some cases where children were eating 3 meals per day, food banks exist to catch those children through the gaps. And so that's making sure, as Kurt said, we are partnering with schools to layer on additional food for those families when they're driving through to pick up those meals, doing a home delivery program to family that can't get out to the meal distributions, which is a huge issue with transportation limitations, specifically in a city like Houston, and making sure we're advocating for SNAP, making sure SNAP availability is necessary so families can shop in a dignified manner to pick food for their households. And so that's a key role that food banks play.
Kirk, in a more naive time, and I'm thinking of late spring, there were people thinking, we would be through it by now. We're not. And I think with more wisdom, there's probably more of an understanding that we may not be through this for a long time, that there's a fall and winter coming up, and there's some projections of an increase in infection rates during that time period. How, if at all, is Forgotten Harvest planning ahead, now knowing where all the barriers and pitfalls are?
Well, thank you for that question, John, because it has to be what most of us is keeping us up at night. I'm sure that, Forgotten Harvest is experiencing probably what a lot of our partners are experiencing. We did have a moment in time where we all were panicking about where food was coming from. Clutch, we got the program from the federal government that gives us these food boxes, and a lot of us are engaged to make sure we have that to get fresh food and vegetables out. But that's going to stop abruptly in December. So while we were all trying to address the need, keep up with the pace of the need, fundraise, and also supply these boxes fluidly to the community, we're all trying to figure out what our budgets look like going forward. And there's a juggling process of trying to figure out how much do you keep this rich burn of this like special format of serving the community based on how you also manage the resources you have, knowing that everybody's also going through financial hardship at certain levels. So our donor relationships are important to keep right in front of us, keeping everybody transparently aware of how we're doing things and how we're trying to make changes. And our hope is that we can stay in this for as long as the need is there, and addressing the challenge with the community as much as possible. And at the end of the day, we have to partner. We have to collaborate. We have to reach out to any and everybody who's willing to get up and contribute, volunteer, and do some of the work so that we can go longer together instead of
Right.
trying to do it by ourselves and go short.
Nicole, I'd like you to take on a question that we've received from somebody who's joining us from out there in the world, named Ellen. Hello, Ellen, and thanks for your question. And the question is, can you comment on how critical are the food banks for undocumented communities?
Oh, food banks are huge for the undocumented communities in a couple of ways. One in which to support without any questions, and the other to advocate for. When Kurt spoke about the Farmers to Family Food Box program deployed by the USDA, that program was deployed with no questions asked, no intake. And that's really the role food banks are able to do. Not only are we able to locate the food, but we're logistics organizations. We know how to get it to the right people in a trustworthy manner so people feel safe retrieving food for their households during this time period. And so it's a critical role that food banks play.
All right, Nicole and Kirk, I want to thank you very much for this insight, which was really useful. Actually, it's inspiring to know that you're on it, that you're so serious, and that it sounds as though you're organizing your communities and you're getting some support and you're thinking ahead. That's, as Susan said before, we like to finish on an optimistic note, and I think you've given us that. So thanks to both of you for joining us. Now I want to go into a session that is produced by our underwriter, Nestle Waters North America. In a moment, we're going to be meeting Tara Carrero, who's Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer of Nestle Waters North America. And she will be moderating a conversation with Leslie Boggs, who is President of the National PTA. But first, we have this message.
I grew up in poverty, and meals weren't always easy to come by.
As kids start the new school year, millions will be struggling to get the food they need to learn.
If your family is in need, Nestle Pure Life and No Kid Hungry are here to help.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to the Atlantic for having us. We have heard a lot of really incredible insight so far today, focusing on children's health from a lot of different angles. And to help us continue that conversation, I am truly delighted to welcome Leslie Boggs, President of National PTA, that is the National Parent Teacher Association, and they do advocate every day for the success of our children. In the interest of transparency, I do want to share that Nestle Waters North America has been working with National PTA on children's health issues for the past 2 years. Now, Leslie, I know that National PTA and PTAs across the country are working very hard to help families and school communities navigate the challenges that have arisen from the pandemic. And as we heard from the prior panel, one of those biggest critical needs is food insecurity. And in addition to the more than $1 million in grants that National PTA has provided to address this and other critical needs, how can parents and teachers partner to really help children have the kind of healthy diets that support their success?
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here today and be a part of this really important conversation, Tara. I appreciate the invitation. And what we want everyone to know is that National PTA believes that there is a natural partnership between parents, educators, and school leaders across this nation. And it's important, especially during this time of crisis, that we understand and we do a concerted effort to address the health, safety, and well-being of our nation's children. And we know that they really have to have access, right, to those healthy foods and beverages that were discussed earlier. And because students can't learn without them, they have to have adequate nutrition. And so we know that healthy students really make better learners. And so it's a concerted effort throughout our association, especially during this time, that we find a concerted way to help navigate this hard crisis that we're really sitting here in the middle of. And so there's some things that we've done together. Is we've hosted a 4-part food insecurity webinar that's certainly given tools for parents and educators to look at. We have really looked at what nonprofits and PTAs are doing across the nation that have been successful, and then what they can do now during this time within their communities. And then we advocate and do a lot of policy work to make sure to help reduce and prevent food insecurities. So one thing that PTA did in Florida it was interesting as we went through these grants that you mentioned earlier, is they chose to work with a nonprofit, One More Child, and use the grant funding to purchase nutritious foods from a wholesale grocery store. And so they really handled the food in the way in accordance to FDA rules and guidelines and CDC, and they were able to provide food for 140 children over a period of 8 weeks. And so it's these joint efforts when parents get together and have critical conversations about what's happening in their communities that they find and come together and find those partners to make sure that we're addressing those needs with those students. So it really is important that we all know the importance of really giving our voice, understanding the need to have those conversations with our school leaders and with our community leaders as well, as we navigate through how we get through this, because parents, as mentioned earlier, our unemployment rates are higher than they've ever been before. And so there's really a huge need for food for all families here. And so we work together to make sure that happens in those PTA.
Thank you, Leslie. Another critical need that we've also been talking about and that you've supported through your grant program is the social and emotional well-being of children. And we know that we are facing unprecedented mental health challenges for our children right now. What are ways that school communities and families can get together to help support students' mental health?
Well, it's really important that we not only address the physical well-being of our children, but also the mental and emotional health of our children. During this grant process, again, we really had a critical conversation with a school counselor who told us that children are no longer worried about what their peers are saying, right? They're no longer worried so much about their grades, but they are worried about, will my parents die? Will I die? Am I going to be okay? And how can we go forward? So what this PTA did was navigate the process together so they could come together and have some experts talk to the parents and students that could have questions, and gave this panel of experts. So it really helped the parents and families in their communities and really helped support that mental and emotional well-being of those students. And it's always important to remember that we need to consider equity and the fact that different communities are being impacted to different degrees and have various levels of access to supports, because a lot of children were getting those supports in school. And so they're no longer getting that support. So how can we work together to make sure that they are getting those essential supports? And so this includes, we need to teach them about social and emotional learning, connecting students with counseling, and providing families the tools they need to have mental health conversations at home. And what we've really been doing and working on is we're going to have a mental health webpage launched next month. And this really is going to help everyone understand what is mental health and have those critical conversations with educators and giving them the tools to be successful, but also for the families to have that conversation as well at home with their students, because it's stressful. They didn't sign up to be teachers, right? They're at home working, and now all of a sudden they're teaching as well. So there's a lot of stress happening both for family members as well as for our students.
Absolutely. We've talked about nutrition, we've talked about mental health. With traditional recess and PE being reimagined, what can be done, how do school communities, teachers, parents partner to make sure kids have the physical activity that they need to stay alert?
Well, during this time, again, that critical conversation with teachers about what we need for our students is critical. And one of those is we know that they have to be physically active at some point during the day. Sitting in front of a computer for all of us is stressful after a long period of time. And so there's a part of the day that we need to set aside for our children to go outside and be physically active. They need to have a healthy activity because it helps their brain and it helps them reconnect when they need to be in the classroom. So this is really crucial for our students and for our families to understand that, again, we knew it before, not sitting in front of a screen all the time was good for them. And so now we're asking them to do it now more than ever. So a lot of times partnering with the school and their PE time and recess time and giving them exercises to do together and making it a lot of fun to do together. So that's really important.
Great, thanks. And just one more question before we go, Leslie. I know that PTA offers a tremendous number of resources, from distance learning and teaching, bridging the digital divide. Where can parents and teachers and caregivers get more information?
On our website, I encourage you to go to www.pta.org and /COVID-19. You'll find lots of resources there. Also, if you go to pta.org /back to school, we have a wonderful podcast called Notes to the Backpack. It's got some great podcasts and great resources for families during this critical time.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there for now. Leslie, thank you so much. We appreciate all the practical tips and advice.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Kate Julian, a senior editor at The Atlantic, and also relevant to this conversation, the parent of 2 elementary schoolers. For our final conversation of the day, we'll explore how the sudden shift to distancing is affecting the mental health of children, particularly younger ones, those aged 9 and under. We'd like to welcome Dr. Jeanette Betancourt, Senior Vice President for U.S. Social Impact at Sesame Workshop, and Dr. Jennifer Pendley, Chief Psychologist at Nemours AI DuPont Hospital for Children and Professor of Pediatrics at Sidney Kimmel Medical College, Thomas Jefferson University. Thank you both so much for joining us. Dr. Pendley, let's start with the really big picture question. Are the kids going to be all right? I know it may be too early for us to know for sure how distancing will affect mental health in the long term, but what can we guess based on what we do know?
Well, you're right. I think we're in the middle of a pandemic that the country's really never, or the world hasn't ever experienced in the same way. And so the science is just now coming in. There have been some research that is showing certainly there's an increase in concerns about children's mental health and how they're coping right now. But we also know that there are things that we can do to help mitigate the stress that is going on, and that there's really important factors in how we protect children and help them feel safe. And we know that the presence of a healthy relationship with a supportive adult can do so much for kids. And so while we are concerned, and there are certainly an increase in anxiety and depression, an increase in domestic abuse and child abuse, we also know that many kids are doing well. And we also know that there are very practical things that caregivers can do to help support their children.
I'd like to sort of drill down on that many kids point and ask as a follow-up. We know obviously that not all kids and parents are experiencing the pandemic the same way. We've talked about that a lot today. But I'd like to sort of specifically focus on distancing for different groups. So across the socioeconomic spectrum, or for kids who are differently abled or who may have struggled with anxiety in the past, are there any sort of specific concerns you see for those groups? And I'll throw this one to Dr. Pendley.
Well, I think what you said is so important, that there's so many individual differences of whether it's different inability, different economic, different, we know that COVID is hitting and highlighting in it and really expanding some racial differences and disparities that we're seeing. And so, yes, it does affect kids and families in different ways. I think, though, again, there's things that we can do to help mitigate that. And for children that have a lot of anxiety, there are ways that we can provide reassurance without negating their feelings. And I think one thing we can do is not assume what children are feeling, but ask them and ask if they're okay and know that all emotions are all right. And so if some children are doing great, that's wonderful, and let them tell us. And for those who are anxious or worried or angry or mad, to not negate those feelings and not say, oh, everything will be fine, you don't need to feel that way, but to acknowledge it, and maybe even sometimes say, you know what, I'm worried too. And when I'm worried, I do such and such, so that we can model how to cope.
Dr. Betancourt, I think this is a perfect seg to asking you, in your work with Sesame Street, you have been focusing so much on how to help parents adapt to the limbo. This is, as Jennifer was saying, an unprecedented situation. There is no end date. There is very little certainty. So what would you say to those of us who are parents about what to tell kids when there aren't clear answers? How honest should we be?
When it comes to honesty, I think we have to consider in the context that we're in. And it also depends on the age of children. And we're talking about those infant toddlers and preschoolers in early school age. And the way to approach that is very much like Dr. Penley indicated, being transparent in terms of that you're there as a support and we're here together as a family, and also to reach out in other ways to get help from others, whether it's neighbors, whether it's our education or healthcare system support. But the main thing, I think, as we're talking about is how do we, on a national level, really put attention to mental health? And as Dr. Penley indicated, there is that resiliency in children, but we're in these unprecedented times where there's multiple stress all around, national, community, and locally in your home. And so one of the things we know is that to successfully parent and feel that all of us as parents are comfortable in that, is acknowledge we need to take care of ourselves, but we can't do it alone. And second, that then we help our children also in their expressing their emotions, but also knowing that it's a circle of care. You can't do it alone. You need to do it with others.
This is a great transition actually to a reader or viewer, I should say, question. Margot in Alexandria, Virginia is wondering whether either of you have any advice for parents on how we can learn and demonstrate resiliency during this time of distancing, and in the process model it for kids. And then she adds, if resilience isn't the right attribute to focus on, what should we be doing to keep ourselves sane during this time of social distancing? So some of this follows up on what you were just saying, Dr. Betancourt, but can you think of anything in terms of parents' own modeling that we could give people here?
In terms of parents themselves modeling, what you want to do is know what is most important for young children's well-being. And that is a sense of safety, routines, especially for younger children. Routines is like the critical thing. And during these unprecedented times, that's often a little difficult. Plus flexibility, everything's changing. So how do you adapt to that? One, plan. In other words, as you are trying new things, because again, going back outside, going back to school, all is now very different. So prepare children to do that as you also prepare yourself as an adult to take care of yourself. Resilience is an interesting word because it is innately what we strive for. But I prefer to sort of look at that what you're trying to do is establish a sense of comfort and a sense of safety that allows you to feel that a young child knows who to turn to, as well as that adults know who to turn to as well. So the same kind of balance that we think of children, we should have as grown-ups.
That's very helpful. While we're talking about these youngest of children, the sort of 0 to 4-year-old set, I'd like to ask Dr. Penley if you can reassure parents of kids in this age group a little bit about how social distancing pertains to this age group specifically. I know a lot of parents are wondering whether they're going to be missing really crucial developmental milestones because of lack of social context. What would you say to them?
I do get asked a lot, and we hear a lot, well, is this going to impact our toddlers and our preschool for life? And I just want to tell parents and remind parents that a parent's own interactions with a young child are more important than the external social opportunities. And that there's so many ways we can foster development in our little ones through our own play and through our siblings, interactions with siblings. We know that siblings model a lot of how we resolve conflict, how we learn give and take with social relationships. We can use the virtual learning environment too for, grandparents can read books through a Zoom and have a nighttime story. We can play outside with social distancing where you can still do charades from a distance away. So you can create a lot of those interactions, but again, for parents, just to realize the power that you have as a parent, and it's not to put more pressure, and you don't have to do it perfect. You just have to be in love, and that's what you're already doing. So it's not to give yourself a break a little bit from that feeling that you have to do everything perfect that was talked about earlier today, and realize that every opportunity that you have with your little one is an opportunity for their development and for you to help them grow.
I love those specific suggestions, from the story hour to the charades outside. Dr. Betancourt, some of this can be so hard to really drill down into. Can you think of any sort of comparably specific tips or activities that parents might try setting up for kids during this time of distancing?
Oh, yes. It's that idea of taking a child's lead. Children love play and curiosity. So anything that is of interest, for example, exploring your own apartment or home and all the places that you may have in there, asking your child to sort of explain what's special about that place. Making what we call comfy, cozy spaces sometimes is a wonderful thing. So putting a little bit of cushions in the corner, and that becomes a wonderful place to, as a family or with siblings, to read books or to explore and do a puzzle, or to have children pick out their favorite, something they want to explore that's new. Going outside and keeping in mind that we're thinking of going outside probably in the warmer weather. For some reason, we are more reluctant on the colder weather, but for children, oh my goodness, what a wonderful way to explore rain and puddles and snow as we get into the deeper, fall and winter. So having those opportunities to explore our neighborhood and environment is such a wonderful way to extend children's curiosity. The other thing I would say for further ideas, we have a wonderful site called sesamestreetandcommunities.org, where there's a vast number of resources, whether it's for COVID or for other playful activities like this that are available.
Terrific.
And one more thing is that we know that kids of all ages love to give to others. And there's been a lot of research that has shown that doing acts of kindness have positive effects on us physiologically and psychologically. And so what better way to have, to be with your child of making cards for the neighbors or doing random acts of kindness around the neighborhood. Or if you are been gardening, there's been a big increase in gardening, share those extra vegetables with the food bank and be able to give to others, and really that builds a sense of community and also gives both parents and kids a sense of control that there is something that they can do to make this world a little bit better.
Yeah, I was sort of struck just this past weekend by how much my kids enjoyed participating in a neighborhood creek trash pickup. I mean, they thought this was the most fun thing they had done all summer, believe it or not, but they felt like they were doing something to make the world a bit better. Moving on to kids their age, elementary school age kids a bit, who may be getting certain things out of play normally in terms of the ability to explore boundaries, to develop autonomy. Do you have any suggestions, and I'd love to hear from both of you on this, about things we can do to help our kids develop independence during this period of time, even if they're not getting it playing outside of the house unsupervised the way they might normally be?
Mhm. What I could say is that we use similar strategies, even though we're Sesame Street and we're focused on those younger, you
Yeah.
use similar strategies. The idea of how we as a family are doing different chores at home, having that ability to pick and choose and then carry out those chores. I think also, as Dr. Penley indicated, the idea of also giving, but allowing them to have the autonomy to come up with those concepts and figuring it out and allowing them to take the lead. The other thing is that idea that we often don't acknowledge that doing a failure, quote unquote, is okay. You could try, you can problem solve, things may not work out, but talk about the process of what didn't work, and maybe eventually it could lead to what works. So that gives an incredible skills of self-analysis, of problem solving.
Right, I agree. There's a lot of things that we do have control over. And so to really be thinking of what do we have control, and school age kids might be able to take ownership of a meal, of what they're going to cook, or what's for dinner that night, what they're going to wear, how do they want to, we talked about a little bit about routines, which I agree. Having routines is like one of the best things we can do for kids to really give a sense of boundary and predictability. But we don't have to decide that routine for them. They can, as kids get older, they can help participate on what they want their day to look like and to have those discussions. So to focus on those areas. And again, I agree, if something doesn't work, that's okay. That's a great learning opportunity and to discuss. You actually don't want things to work all the time. I mean, sometimes we think we do, but that's how we learn, is to do a redo and to try something different.
Excellent. So we're out of time almost. I'd love to wrap with one lightning round question. If you were to imagine, each of you, that we're 2 years in the future right now, and you were looking back on this period of distancing, and you had to single out one possible silver lining for kids and families in one sentence or so, what might it be? Dr. Betancourt.
The incredible problem solving and heroism of our families and their children.
Dr. Penley.
I'd like to quickly just go back to something that was talked about earlier, that all the stress with the social distancing, with COVID, and with the attention on the racial reckoning gives us an opportunity to rebuild some systems and maybe be able to address the systemic racism that we see in our society, and hopefully reduce disparities that already exist.
Seems like a very powerful note to end on. So let's stop right there. Thank you both, Drs. Penley and Betancourt, so very much for joining us. And with that, I will turn things back to you, John.
Thanks very much, Kate. And that is how you make an hour fly by during a pandemic, with a set of conversations that is important and useful and passionate and compassionate, and just right for the time. So I want to thank everybody who took part in the conversations. I want to thank the great producers at the Atlantic for putting these conversations together, and to all of you for tuning in. I want to thank you as well. For more on the topic that we're discussing, and also on the ongoing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic, just go visit the Atlantic site, atlantic.com. We're going to be doing more on this topic in upcoming events, and please be sure to look for future communications on those and visit us. The AtlanticFestival.com is coming up, and to register for the 12th annual Atlantic Festival that's taking place September 21st through September 24th. Again, go to the Atlantic.com. Thank you, everybody. I'm John Donvan. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.